Hi everybody and welcome to another online lesson. Today we're going to look at the Nazi economic policies following the election in 1933. We're going to try and answer the question, was there an economic miracle? All right, really interesting, fascinating topic this is. Again, one of those ones that we can sort of relate to right now with the economic crisis, cost of living crisis and stuff that we're living through at the moment. But again, a really good opportunity to be practicing that section B skills when we think about quite clearly yes or no. One interpretation yes, one interpretation no. All right, so the aim of this lesson is to understand how the Nazis reduced unemployment, and we use that word in inverted commas as well. You'll see why later. And to evaluate whether people's lives were better by 1939. So was there an economic miracle? The interpretations are quite straightforward in this. Yes, there was. Hitler solved the problems. No, he didn't. Or some people's lives were better, some people's lives were worse, or generally people's lives improved or they didn't. Very, very similar to the Stresemann golden years, when we had clear interpretations there whether or not we think Stresemann solved the problems of the early Weimar Republic. So a nice topic, especially one towards the end of the Germany course, and also quite a nice one to revise and prepare for your exams at the end of year 11. Okay, so let's start with a little quote from Hitler, who said this in February 1933 in the Reichstag. So he's not long been elected, a couple of weeks. He says the next 5 years in Germany must be devoted to the rearmament of Germany. Every job creation scheme must be judged by whether it helps rearmament. Germany's position in the world will depend on the position of Germany's armed forces. Upon this, the position of Germany's economy also depends. So just pause the video and write a little inference that you can get from that speech. Obviously, question 1 on your Germany exam is an inference question, so any excuse to practice that is always good. So an inference is something that quote makes you think, not necessarily what it says. So something you think about, and then unpause, and we'll have a little look, see what you come up with. Okay, so I think the main obvious inference from this quote is that Hitler's priority was the army, not anything else. The fact that he says everything depends on that, blah, 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 blah. Also, remember that they're not allowed to rebuild the army thanks to the Treaty of Versailles. So by this point, when he's saying this, should have started raising alarm bells across Europe and America maybe, because he's saying he wants to rearm the country, but he's not allowed to. And as you know, if you're watching this as revision, or just generally because you missed the lesson, you are aware by now of the Enabling Act, which means that he basically ripped up the Treaty of Versailles anyway. So there was no secret to it, but this is one of those points of appeasement where we criticise Neville Chamberlain a little bit, the British Prime Minister, for perhaps appeasing Hitler for too long. And maybe if they stepped in sooner when he started saying things like this, maybe perhaps World War II might not have happened. Okay, so let's move into this topic then. So what was the rate of unemployment in 1932? Just say this to yourself, hopefully out loud you're saying 6 million. This is the people who voted for the Nazis, remember, or lots of them who voted for the Nazis and some for the communists. So reducing unemployment is a priority for Hitler. Why do you think that is? Pause the video and write just one sentence why you think reducing unemployment was a priority, and then come back to the video when you're ready. Okay, so unemployed workers suffer poor conditions. That means Hitler can't help them. They're more likely to go communist because when you've got nothing to lose and you've got nothing, all of a sudden communism appeals. Remember that for the Cold War course as well. So Hitler probably wants people to not be so poor that communism appeals. The Nazis also see unemployed people as a waste of resource. They wanted everyone contributing to society and service to the country. So everyone needs to do something in this country, in this economy to make it roll. And poverty can increase crime. We know that from the Elizabeth course, don't we? That in Tudor times, Elizabeth attempted to deal with the poverty and the vagabondage because poor people are desperate, which means probably and possibly can lead to crime. So they're the reasons why Hitler's going to have to try and address this unemployment crisis. Each of them are valid in their own, and all put them all together, you can see why the Nazis saw this as a priority. Okay, so how might you reduce unemployment? Make a list in your books or in your Google Doc, however you're doing this lesson online, maybe 3 or 4 things that you might do if you were going to try and reduce unemployment. Then this whole lesson, well, the first half of it essentially, will be looking to see if you are correct and maybe give you some extra ideas as well, how the government did it. When you are ready, unpause the video when you've made your list, and we'll carry on through this lesson and see what you come up with. Okay, so a little graph to think about. Again, practicing source questions all the time. They could be question 1 or they could be the source question for question 3A. Let's have a little think what this graph tells us and suggests about the Nazis' economic policies. So try and work it out a little bit by looking at this. Write a few notes in your Google Doc or in your book to see if you can work out what's happening. It sounds and looks impressive. I've got to say that. Okay, so pause the video when you're ready, unpause, and we'll just really quickly break it down. Right, so quite clearly, hopefully to you, you've seen that in the years of Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1939, unemployment has gone down massively, almost to zero by the start of World War II. So you would look at this graph and you would immediately think the Nazis' economic policies were successful and there was an economic miracle. So that's going to be our starting point when we look at a graph like this. But of course, you can do anything you want with statistics. Don't forget that. All right, so policy number one. In your books or however you're doing this, notes, just do them in bullet points or little paragraphs for each one. So this could be a paragraph in a 12 marker that might say, explain why the Nazis were able to reduce unemployment. You would say, paragraph one reason why the Nazis were able to reduce unemployment was the RAD, the Reich Labour Service. So this, everything, all the bullet points and notes from this screen will be part of that paragraph. Okay, so let's get started. They provided work, and we'll again say work in inverted commas, for the unemployed. They have produced something for poor people or unemployed people to do. So things like, for example, public works like fixing roads, planting trees, draining marshes, building bridges, fixing coastal walls, and sports facilities. A really good example there is these unemployed people will have been set to work for the Olympic Stadium in 1936. And these projects are good for Germany as a whole too. Obviously, they're making Germany stronger. Look better, just look nicer. So this is one thing that they did that definitely reduced unemployment. But when we say work, we'll see in a minute whether the work is good, well paid. You can clearly see the jobs up there are hard manual labour, difficult in lots of ways. But at least you could say, arguably, they have work. All right. In 1935, the RAD became compulsory for all 18 to 25-year-olds. They had to serve 6 months in the RAD. This led to about 422,000 members. So if we take the 422,000, it's almost 500,000 off that 6 million unemployed from the Great Depression. That's a really good start, isn't it? Okay, so you can hopefully turn this into a little paragraph about how the RAD has led to unemployment being reduced, but also be thinking about if this was section B, an interpretation or a source on the RAD. One person might interpret this to being a great thing. They got work, they were able to contribute, where another interpretation might be whinging about the quality or the difficulty of the work. So for example, you might get this in a text, in a source. It was not popular at all. Pay was low and conditions were poor. But remember, at least they've got a job. And of course, the work shy, that was on our list, wasn't it, of enemies of the state. So you probably wanted to be doing something to avoid being sent to a camp for being work shy. And you can see from these photographs, it looks very much like a military sort of thing, doesn't it? Like an operation. Everyone in rows, following instructions, even uniforms. So it very much is part of the military, isn't it? It's organised like an army. The workers wore uniforms and lived in camps. They have to do drills and they have to do parades. So basically, this is just like being in the army. Many saw the RAD as just a service for the Nazis, not actually providing real work. And we can see that, you know, draining marshes, putting trees and stuff, planting trees. They're not, I wouldn't say, incredibly important jobs for the nation, for the country, but the Nazis would say, look, you've got a job and you've got at least some pay. If you don't like the RAD, go and sort yourself out and get a proper job, I guess you could argue, couldn't you? So with the RAD there, we've clearly seen two examples where we could say it was good, providing a service, and we can also see from this screen the negatives of it. Keep that in mind if these were interpretations. This would be your own knowledge as to why some people did not like the RAD. Okay, so that's policy one in its nutshell, really. But we can see from these sources, just again to practice sources, Hitler greeting men in the Labour service. They're obviously saluting as they walk past. It is essentially an army, isn't it? For these young men, and partly probably follows on from the Hitler Youth as well, to make sure these are getting drilled in following orders, obedience, things like that. So some facts that you might want to talk about if you want to talk about the RAD being responsible for the autobahns. So they're the roads that they're famous in Germany for having no speed limit. They built 7,000 miles of motorway to improve transport around Germany. 1935, there were 125,000 men employed for the Autobahn alone. If we add that to the 400,000 that we've just seen for the RAD generally, when we're starting to chip off some of that 6 million, aren't we? So these public buildings created many jobs, but quicker and cheaper transport on these roads, so left to right, east to west, they helped move goods around. So that improved industry and agriculture because you weren't taking so long to get things from one side of the country to the other. Somewhere probably in there is a plan for a war as well, in moving troops from west to east. And vice versa. Remember, in the Western Front and the Eastern Front in World War One, they're well aware, aren't they, of fighting a war on two fronts and stretching your resources. So the Autobahn probably played some part in that as well. So the Autobahn is just a nice little fact for you to put into your paragraph about the RAD. Okay, so we've got the Olympic Stadium and we've got the Autobahn as your sort of go-to pictures for that. Sources, and then source B shows Hitler planting or doing the first bit of turf in the Autobahn. Typical propaganda of government showing some big policy or project that they're doing. Okay, you can bet your bottom dollar that Hitler put that spade down straight away as soon as the picture was taken. So again, a bit of propaganda, but it basically says if Hitler's willing to get involved, then so should you as well. Okay. Hopefully, you've got the RAD sorted. It's nice and straightforward. The Reich Labour Service, labour just means work, basically providing these young lads some work to be done. All right, so just some context to the next one. So policy 2 is to rearm, basically create soldiers, Navy, Air Force, whatever you want to think about. Within the military, as we've said at the start of this lesson, they're not allowed to do this. But here we are. Hitler has ignored the Treaty of Versailles, which limited the soldiers to just 100,000. We know following the Night of the Long Knives that all the SA were then brought into the army. So by 1939, there are about 1.4 million extra people in the armed forces. You can take that off the 6 million as well. This has helped reduce unemployment, obviously, because they're now doing jobs. Some may say that the army jobs, though, aren't particularly providing for society, but of course they are preparing for a war, which we know is inevitable. There are around 70,000 new aircraft constructors from 1935 onwards. Basically, we are going against the treaty, but they are putting people into jobs. And the people who work in the armament industry they're going to get paid a little bit more than everybody else, just because we know from Hitler's quote at the start of this lesson that rearming Germany was his priority. They were planning to do it by 1940, but they were ready by 1939, as we know, and that was the start of World War II. So in that sense, the Nazi policy for rearmament was ahead of schedule, was very, very successful. So you've now got two policies to reduce unemployment. You've got the RAD and you've got the rearmament policy, where they're just putting people into the army or the military forces and building and making equipment. All right, so nice, easy one there as well. So policy 3, and this one is the most interesting and will be paragraph 3 in a 12 marker if you would wanted to, is what we'd call invisible unemployment. And this is where it gets a little bit naughty, really, sort of fudging the figures. And I'm sure all governments do it, but this is one way in which the Nazis managed to fudge the figures to reduce unemployment, but although possibly not really. So some may say the Nazis didn't reduce it at all. They created new jobs. A lot of those jobs weren't particularly useful for anybody and were quite expensive. They just found ways to reduce the numbers of people recorded as unemployed. This is the issue here. All right, so we're talking about what was written and what was presented can be now changed or fudged to be recorded as unemployed. So this image you can see on the screen now, just pause the video and have a little look around each of them. Get your head around how each of these reduced unemployment. Maybe it'd be a good idea to put all of them into one sentence, and then perhaps to be thinking about which was the most clever, which was the most effective maybe way of reducing unemployment from that 6 million. So we'll just focus a little bit when you get back on it on the change in statistics. Okay, so go and summarize each box into one sentence, and then that should hopefully get you thinking about this. Again, these would be some of your facts that you would produce in a paragraph on invisible unemployment. You need 3 of these. Okay, when you're ready, unpause and we'll carry on. Okay, welcome back. So, change in statistics for what is one that I particularly like using in this story, because as you can see there, they suddenly made part-time work count as full-time. So that means that the statistics that show people who are unemployed, or you wouldn't include part-time usually, they are now counted as full-time employees. So therefore that gets the numbers down. a little bit like probably today in our country, if you've heard of 0 hours contracts. So 0 hours contracts, basically, you might never work, but technically on the statistics, the government can say that you've got a job. So 0 hours contracts, basically, the company will phone you up and say, can you work so many hours this week? And you can say yes or no. So you might get work or you might not get work. There's no minimum that you sometimes, if you had a contract, you are contracted at least 12 hours a week or 18 hours a week or whatever, the company have to provide you with those kind of hours, whereas 0 hours, you don't. But technically, you've still got a job. So you can hopefully see how that looks a bit like fudging the figures, especially in the government's overall. So we've talked about the Labour Service, we've talked about rearmament. The SA, SS, and Gestapo, they're not real jobs, as you've seen in the box, but they're still things that people are doing. So it might be admin jobs in the SD, I don't know, but basically not jobs that are, I suppose, contributing to the country, but there's still something that some people are doing. The armed forces, we've talked about that as well, and prisons. So by putting all these people into camps, obviously when they're in camps, they lose their job, and those jobs are just given to the unemployed. Okay, dead simple. All these enemies of the state who did have a job, perhaps, especially when you think about the Jews and other minorities, when they're removed from their jobs and sent to camps and eventually sent to the ghettos later on in the 30s, then you can clearly see how they managed to do that. Women as well. They are obviously sent home or advised to go home. This is the policies. We've looked at that in recent weeks, haven't we? Where they are given medals to have children, but they have to give up their jobs essentially when they get married. So that gets women off the figures, and those jobs are then given to the men. So overall, you could argue that there are some definite policies and things to get people working, but looking at this invisible unemployment, there's a couple of things in there that are a little bit sort of dodgy in terms of actually providing work. You just have to get your head around this as a paragraph on invisible unemployment. Okay, so hopefully that makes it nice and clear with your little summaries as well. Which of these do you think were maybe the top three? And they may well be the top three facts that you would include in a paragraph on invisible unemployment. So overall then, did they achieve their aims of reducing unemployment, success or failure? This is going to be your own knowledge in the section B 20 marker if the section B is looking at the Nazi economy. Okay, so you're going to obviously have one interpretation that will argue that it was successful, and you're going to have one interpretation that would argue or suggest that it was not. And you'd need to support your quotes from those interpretations with some of this knowledge here. So firstly, if you're going to be looking at the successful paragraph, yeah, they reduced unemployment by 4 million. Reduced unemployment meant there was no public resentment towards the Nazis. So some of the dodgy things they were doing that perhaps a lot of people weren't that bothered by or weren't in support of, at least they can say, you know, you promised in the election work and bread, and you provided work and bread. So that maybe turned a few people away from some of the more negative things that the Nazis were doing. But arguably, you still use this as own knowledge that explain in regards to a quote perhaps that said jobs were provided. You know that they did do that, which meant people didn't oppose. Unemployment in Britain, according to the statistics, and by propaganda, especially used by the Nazis probably, had only fallen by 1 million in the 1930s. Now, you could argue that was 1 million proper jobs maybe, but certainly that's much less than the 4 million in Germany. And of course, that's a good example to give some more knowledge to show that it was successful. On the flip side, unemployment was falling everywhere in the world following the Great Depression. So Germany was just benefiting like every other country seemed to be. Trade had improved after the Depression. As always, when we look at capitalism, we know there's always a boom and a bust, always a boom and a bust every so many decades. So in that sense, there wasn't really anything the Nazis did. They sort of just benefited a little bit from the world improving. Jews, women and political prisoners, they were taken off the figures even though they were still there. So your obviously percentages then go down if there are less people being counted. So obviously, let's just say for argument's sake, there are 100 million people in Germany. If you take out women, there's half of that gone. So now you're just working that off just 50 million people. So your numbers obviously go up. So that's an example perhaps of how they haven't quite had an economic miracle, and you talk about that in your own knowledge. To support a quote that maybe references the invisible unemployment, you just turn that into your own words. And then some jobs created in the armament industries and security forces, they're not real jobs. So they're just sort of jobs that, in a time of peace, you don't really need soldiers. You don't really need people doing those kind of things. You know, planting trees and draining marshes, they're not really proper jobs. So you could also talk about that as how they're perhaps not. too successful. So overall, we've got a good idea of some examples of how they solve the economic miracle, I guess, but also some negatives to that. And you can see you've got two sides of an argument for section B. Now, section B includes a source question as well. So you're going to have one source that supports a miracle and one source that doesn't. And remember that you're keeping that in mind to compare to the interpretations for question 3C when we're arguing why are the sort interpretations different, because they're based on different sources. And obviously you'll be able to match them up quite obviously. One will be positive and one will be negative. Okay, one final negative then to put into that, the public works were supported by high government cost. Because those things weren't making money, draining marshes and planting trees doesn't make you money. The government is having to pay for those things, pay those people to do those jobs, which obviously in the long run is not viable and obviously leads to it failing in the end, which is perhaps one of the reasons why they had to bring women back into the workforce as we get towards the end of the 30s. So you make your decision on this one, successful or not. Just make sure you're really confident on how they had an economic miracle or not. It's a good topic. It's a really nice topic to argue about because there's clearly good facts for both sides. So that's part one done, reducing unemployment. Hopefully you're feeling pretty confident on that. If you're not, please make sure you ask your teacher. Just get a few little bits clarified and hopefully your notes are essentially in 3 paragraphs. Ready for the next little bit, living conditions. So very similar to Stresemann's Germany when we looked at was there a golden age? This is very much the same. Did people's lives get better under the Nazis? Okay, so copy this diagram into your book, pause the video or onto your Google Doc, however you're doing it, and we'll reveal some information that show lives have gone up and lives have gone down. This again is going to be your knowledge for support or against that interpretation that people's lives got better and some people's lives did not. This is going to be your own knowledge, okay? So first of all, before we reveal, go and draw this and these two facts and figures in the orange boxes. Put them where you think they will go. And then when you're ready, unpause and we'll carry on. Okay, so we can see the rise in wages compared with 1933, that they have gone up. Okay, so 20% in 1939. That's going to be an example of people's lives getting better. The rise in sale of goods compared with 1933, though. So although they've got a 20% rise in wages, everything is 45% higher. This is inflation, not hyperinflation from the 1920s. But again, you can relate to this based on our own living experiences of the last couple of years, where the price of goods have gone up. We've had an inflation crisis in Britain in the last couple of years, where prices are going up quicker than people's wages are. And we've obviously learned that in the Elizabeth course as well. So you've got a nice little bit of context all around for this topic. So in black and white, wages have gone up, that's a good thing. However, costs have gone up as well, which means those pay rises have been sort of wiped out from the cost of living. So some evidence that we can talk about for standard of lives going up, the number of people in employment has gone up. That means people have got a regular income. Of course, that's a positive. Secondly, wages have gone up. All right, so they've gone up. Brilliant. They have gone up. So you can't really argue about that. That's a fact. Now people are able to afford some luxury goods such as cars. So they're your positives, your O knowledge in a source question and the interpretations question if we get a good question like this one, asking whether or not there was improvement in lives. On the negative side of this, though, women and Jews were made to leave their jobs. We know that. Some people hated the labour service. We've talked about that earlier in this lesson. It was hard work, poor pay, poor food, poor conditions, but they had to do it. Otherwise, they ended up in a camp. Furthermore, wages, although wages have gone up, the price of goods, as we've talked about, goes faster, meaning that if you're on a poorly paid job, you are well and truly suffering, okay? Also, it goes without saying that if you're working more to get that extra money, then it's not really a pay rise, is it? So the average number of hours per week that people worked went from 43 to 49. So they're doing an extra 6 hours a week to sort of justify that extra pay. So they're doing more, arguably then for a little bit less, but it entirely depends on your slant on this, on how you read this and how you look into it based on how you present your arguments. Okay, so we've got a nice little start of examples of how people's lives went good or bad. So add into your source sheet, if you've got this from Google Classroom, if you're doing it on catch up, or just your Google Doc if you're doing it for some revision. Let's look at some of these sources and see how they show good or bad. So pause the video and write a few notes about how this source shows people's lives getting better or worse. And when you're ready, unpause and come back to the video. Right, welcome back. So I hope you've noticed there that we can see that in 1927 there was a lot more sort of luxury goods, shall we say? Some nice things like beer, sugars, vegetables, milk, things like that, meat and meat products. And by 1937, you can see that those luxury goods have all sort of gone down a little bit. And the only place that have gone up really is rye bread. So that's like that hard rye vita stuff you might have seen, like the thin, crispy bits. Potatoes. So essentially what we're looking at is people are living on diets of rye bread and potatoes here. A very basic sustenance to eat. Luxury stuff, beer's gone down, tropical fruit's gone down, sugar's gone down, fish has gone down, eggs have gone down. Things that may be nice, bacon has gone down a little bit. So essentially we could make an inference from this that our staple diet has now become bread and potatoes for most working class families. So that's a really good example of how living standards have not improved. So you could use that as your own knowledge to provide some information when it references perhaps in a source or interpretation something about the diets. You can then say, I know this is true because, and then use this for an example. Okay, so then this source, again, source 8, pause the video, make an observation, one sentence in whether you think this is positive or negative in our arguments, and then when you're ready, come back. All right, so what this is essentially showing us is people are paid possibly a tiny smidgen more in 1938 than they were in 1928. So that's a bit of a positive, isn't it? There was a bit of a dip there in 1932, but we know that's during the Great Depression, so we'd expect that. But it's gradually going up in the Nazi years. I wouldn't say it was flying up, but you could definitely argue that this is showing some evidence that people were paid a little bit more. So this is allowed for inflation. So obviously people are essentially just a tiny little bit better off in some industries. All right. So there's some nice bits. And then you read this bit. So when we think about this source, this is talking about those extra hours. So under the Nazis, industrial workers enjoyed regular work and controlled shop prices. So that is better. Lives are better all around there. Their pay was also controlled and they had no trade unions. Remember, Hitler got rid of the trade unions as part of the Enabling Act. The average industrial workers' pay stayed the same from 1929 to 1938. However, they were working more. So although the pay has been the same, they're working more for it, which again clearly is not a positive. That's a real negative, in fact. Average figures always disguise specific changes, though. Of course, the governments are not going to produce negative things. Workers in the armament industries that did improve in their pay, as we've talked about earlier, if you're doing something in the military, your pay was slightly more than those in other industries. So there's a little bit of both in this source, I guess. But overall, generally, I think what it's saying is you're working more for your money. Okay, so if German workers were not happy, the Nazis could start losing support. So they're going to think about some things that they're going to essentially ask or provide to make people happy and get on with their sort of miserable little lives. So they set up a number of organizations to improve German workers. We'll look at these separately now. So we've got the Labour Front, the DAF, Strength Through Joy, the KDF, and the Beauty of Labour. So this is a point on your notes where you maybe just do a little subtitle saying, how did you get people to work harder for less, essentially make them happier? This is the section of this lesson where you're going to bring in some of this. Now, again, there's going to be some positives and some negatives. Of course, the whole thing is about being prepared to have an argument of two sides, improvement or not. So if we start with the DAF first, the Labour Front, this is essentially what's replaced the trade unions. The trade unions will fight for your working rights, fight for pay, fight for better conditions. Well, they've all gone, of course. So the DAF is going to be the replacement of that. And everyone has to join the DAF. So that this is the government who are going to be improving your working conditions, essentially. When the government are involved in this, then you've got to take that with a pinch of salt, I think. So the benefits of being in the German Labour Front is it sets out the rights that all workers are entitled to. Rights that you're entitled to that obviously are created by the government. It set a maximum number of hours that could be worked per week to ensure workers were not overworked. So that's quite nice. That's what a union would do anyway. But of course, this is the government. So if you went against this in any way, then you'd be going against the government and you know you'd end up in a camp. And then finally, the benefits, it sets a minimum wage to ensure that workers were not paid too little. So this is all about getting people to toe the line, plod along, work hard and shut your mouth. They've got at least some benefits that clearly in a civilized country, this is what a employer should do anyway. Not work too hard, pay a reasonable wage. We have a minimum wage in this country as well. It's just enough, isn't it? Sometimes people are working so hard just to earn just enough, though. That's where it probably gets a little bit unfair. So the negatives of the DAF: workers are not allowed to negotiate. Obviously, as we've said, it's the government who do this. So if they're ever unhappy, they have to get on with it or leave, go somewhere else. And if they are brave enough to speak out, then they're going to be in trouble. The number of hours was quite high, higher than it had been in the early 30s and before the 30s. We've talked about that already. So although they are earning a little bit more money, they are doing a lot more hours and they can't complain. Okay, so that's a negative of it. This minimum hours that they can do is still more than they were doing. If workers try to slow down production by maybe going on strike, as we've said, any opposition, they would be punished. So get this little diagram into your paragraph, however you're doing your notes on this for the DAF. Again, always trying to present to you positives and negatives so that you can keep thinking about how this would look in an exam paper. All right, so the KDF, the Strength Through Joy program, is part of the DAF, but it's a deliberate and separate thing to basically show that we're all in this together, creating Germany, making Germany great again, and everyone's playing their part. Everyone's going to be benefiting from this in the long run, and of course, you're expected to join the KDF program. About 35 million people are in this by 1936. So how are you getting people to work harder and longer for less? Before we have a look in the rest of this video, just pause it, make a little list in your book. If you were the government again, how do you get people to happily plod to work, working harder for less? And then unpause the video when you're ready and we'll have a look at some of the things that the Nazis did do. Okay, welcome back. So the KDF, things that they did. Firstly, providing leisure activities for the workers, such as sports events, outings, and even some foreign travel. Hopefully, you maybe got at least one of them. If not, add to your list how you might get people to work harder for less. Essentially, what we're saying here is we're giving them treats. Okay, the most loyal workers could win really impressive holidays. That might motivate you or incentivize you to work a little bit harder. And workers were expected to join. As we've said, there are 35 million of them by 1936. So this might get you to work a little bit harder if you got the chance of going away. Sporting events, maybe tickets for a football game, things like that, just for working hard. Like we do in school, obviously, we have little prizes and raffles and things like that every now and then. So the KDF is essentially trying to incentivize people to work harder. So let's have a little go at question 1, inferring from a source about the support for the KDF. So pause the video, look at this source carefully, and see what you can infer about the support for the Strength Through Joy program from this source. When you're ready, unpause, and we'll have a little look at it and move on. Okay, right. So hopefully you've maybe seen that support, according to this source, was fairly good. There was lots of benefits, people involved. 11 million people went to a theatre. Holidays and cruise, 700,000 people were involved in some of these things. So lots of events. This might infer that basically people were doing all right. This is from the Berlin area across those 6 years. Doesn't necessarily tell us about the whole rest of the country, but certainly in Berlin, you might be able to say that the Strength Through Joy program was working well and people were getting some nice little treats and rewards. All right, another really good example that you'll get into for the KDF is the People's Car. We like using the People's in Germany, don't we? The People's Radio, the People's Court. The People's Car, the Volkswagen. All right, so Volks is folk in German, people. The People's Wagon. The People's Car is a Volkswagen. You might, if you work really hard and you save 5 marks a week into your wages, get a car. So this is a really good incentive. It's called basically saving towards getting a car. People can't afford a car outright. So if you put 5 marks a week away, you're going to end up with a lovely new Volkswagen. This made people work harder. This was another little incentive. And in 1938, of course, as we prepare for World War II, the factories stopped making cars and started making armaments. So in fact, no one ever saw their car or got their money back. Probably a fiddle there, really. But the People's Car was initially an incentive from the Strength Through Joy program, but no one ever got their car or their money. And of course, anyone who maybe complained about that, well, they're taking their sort of life in their own hands, aren't they, by complaining about that. So the Strength Through Joy program, again, has got some strengths and positives. These pictures here, one's a poster, one's a photograph. You can see the actual fun times, a little cruise for the workers here, and you can see in the painting, it's sort of advertising a cruise. So essentially people obviously did do it. We can see as well here the sporting events, stadiums are full of people having a good time, sack racing, things like that. So these photographs would definitely be used as propaganda to show that the Strength Through Joy program was successful and people enjoyed it. And this just helps people all work just a little bit harder and be a little bit more happy in their job. Okay. So the problem with all of that, though, as always, a positive and a negative, is that they have to do these fun things in their own time. So they don't necessarily get time off work to do them, which is a bit of a shame, really. But all right, it's still a treat. It's still something nice that they've got from work for working hard. So then we have the last one, the Deutsche Arbeitersfront, the beauty of labour. So making work beautiful. The beauty of labour was set up to provide better facilities for the workers, better toilets, showers, changing rooms, and canteens. So 34,000 companies had improved their facilities by 1938. So again, this might be something that a traditional union might sort of fight for, but there isn't a union, so the government are providing this to try and make people work a little bit harder and be happier at work. As we all know, if the canteen is amazing, then it just makes work a little bit good. If you can have showers and the facilities at your place of work or for you in school are amazing, then it just helps keep everything a little bit happy, doesn't it? So that's what the beauty of labour. So just think about it, trying to make work beautiful or good, nice. So the labour front, the Strength Through Joy, and the beauty of labour all combine to try and get people to work harder for less with these little incentives and these little sort of trips out and about. You decide yourself if overall this was a positive or negative experience. Always with this economy topic, these are just examples depending on how it's presented to you in an exam. It could be a 12 marker or it could be section B. All right, either way, section B is good and bad, positive or negative, and the 12 marker is dead simple. 3 ways that they improved living conditions, or 3 ways they reduced unemployment, something like that. With a nice firm knowledge of this topic, you can answer a lot of different types of questions. So make sure you are confident on the Nazi economy. All right. Again, with the positives of the beauty of labour, they have to do the building work themselves. If they want a nice new canteen, they have to build it themselves. It's in their own time without extra pay, but it's there. So again, it depends entirely on your slant, whether you accept that as a big negative or just a small negative when you look at the bigger thing altogether. So on this sheet, if you are watching this because you missed the lesson, it will be in your Google Classroom. Otherwise, on your Google Doc, if you're revising this, just look at each of these bullet points and just colour it in or highlight it. Summarize it in obviously much shorter words if you are typing it or rewriting it to show evidence of lives improved or lives did not improve. Maybe you could split your page in half, but essentially you've got 4 categories here that support. You decide, go through them yourself, and hopefully you get some nice balance, which is what we need. And then this, of course, when you're ready, goes on to become the own knowledge of a source question or a section B interpretations question. So when you're ready for that and you're done with that, carry on with the video. So now let's step back a little bit and start practicing this as if it was a section B. Okay, so if you're watching this because you missed the lesson, you can carry on with this bit, but it's definitely more important for year 11s. All right, so I'm going to ask you now to, if you are year 11, to do some revision on this topic, to do this properly as if it was section B. Look at the interpretations and we'll do 3B first, which is what are the views of these interpretations about the standard of living for workers in Nazi Germany. So there's your script. Obviously by now you should know what that is. The view of interpretation 1 about the standards of living of workers in Nazi Germany, remember we must include the words of the question, is, and then I can tell this because it says, so you pause the video, write the answers to this. One of them is going to be positive and one of them is going to be negative. This is one of those nice straightforward ones. And then when you're ready, unpause the video and we will come back to this lesson. Right, welcome back. So interpretation 1, we can start with from 1936 to 1939, wages increased, but this was due to longer working day. In addition, the cost of living rose in 1930s, which meant that real wages actually fell. There's also food shortages because the government reduced agricultural production to keep prices up. So that is negative. That is clearly the negative. So you might say something like, the view of interpretation 1 about the standard of living in workers in Nazi Germany is that life did not get better. In fact, it got worse. I can tell this because it says, I don't know, any of those sentences, the cost of living rose in the 1930s, which meant real wages actually fell. There you go, job done. Whereas interpretation 2, we now know is going to be more positive because it's the other side of the argument. It says, for Germans who conformed to Nazi expectations, living standards went up, unemployment dropped. Nazi statistics show that real wages rose, Only if a worker worked overtime. The Strength Through Joy programme provided many extras. Some benefits, such as loans and medical care, were real enough. So quite obviously, that is a positive. So you'll say, whereas the view of interpretation 2 about the standard of living in workers in Nazi Germany is that life improved. I can tell this because it says, and then pick one of those positive sentences. Real wages rose, unemployment dropped, something like that. So that is your 4 marks for this one straight away, 2 marks each. Now, in real life, you'll have already done question 3A, which is a source question, the same as the trenches. How useful are these sources for an inquiry into the standard of living of workers in Nazi Germany? And you will already know if one of those sources is quite positive and one of them is quite negative. You can start thinking about matching them up for question 3C, which you remember is, why are these interpretations different? They're different because they're based on different sources. And then you just match up one thing that interpretation 1 says, matching up to the negative source, and then one thing that interpretation 2 says that is similar in the negative source. Another easy 4 marks. All right, so here are 2 sources. We've looked at them in this lesson. Can you just pause the video now and just, at the very least, practice matching them up? Which of these interpretations do you think source A and D will match up to? Okay, when you're ready, unpause and come back, and we'll just make sure that you are correct. All right, so welcome back. Hopefully you've matched up source A to interpretation 1, a negative, particularly related to the food shortages bit. And source D, hopefully you've matched up to interpretation 2, which is more positive, isn't it? It's showing all the different events that you could get through the Strength Through Joy program. So you might say something like, interpretation 1 and 2 are different because they are based on different sources. Interpretation 1 is based on sources like source A. This is because source A talks about the decline in food with a basic ration, and interpretation 1 mentions how food shortages have become the norm. Interpretation 2 is based on sources like source D, as source D talks about some of the events you would do on the Strength Through Joy program, matching up to interpretation 2 saying the Strength Through Joy program provided many extras. Hopefully that is nice and straightforward for you too. There's your other 4 marks. Now, source A and source D are the sources that you might get in question 3A. Remember, the whole of section B is on the same topic. In this case, standard of living in Nazi Germany. So once you've sort of got to 3C, you're well and truly ready for your big essay. All right, so hopefully that was nice and easy as well. And then we get to the 20 marker that usually might be a little bit scary, really, but it isn't, especially not in the Germany. We're following our script. We basically need to have an introduction that says how far you agree with interpretation 2. In this case, it was positive. Just say I agree to a larger extent or whatever, the usual, with a little bit of a thesis statement, a little bit why. So overall, looking at the numbers, more people were involved in the Strength Through Joy program than weren't. Maybe the millions that you've seen in this lesson, 35 million of them joined up by 1936. And then you do paragraph 1, which is how interpretation 2 is correct. You just basically have to say how the lives did improve in Germany. You'll need at least 2 quotes from interpretation 2, at least 2, and you'll need to match them up to some own knowledge. So the little table in the middle of this, better off and worse off, and everything we've done in today's lesson will give you the O in that. Now you'll know, and you'll hopefully be recognizing that is exactly the same as the source question. The only difference in this 20 marker is you don't need any provenance. So you don't need to worry about who made it or when or any of those things. You just need to pick out 2 quotes, so C, and 2 pieces of own knowledge to back that up. Now, if you've got time, try and pick out a couple, at least 2, maybe 3. But you are not being asked in this 20 marker to write an essay arguing why life got better. You are being asked to argue why the interpretations are, you agree more with the interpretation 1 or 2. Okay, so hopefully that's nice and easy. C plus O, Coco. And then you would go on to the second paragraph. You say, on the other hand, the view of interpretation 1 that life did not get better is also correct. And then you pick out 2 quotes and some own knowledge that proves that, okay? So your negative side of things, hard work, whatever it might be. So that is how the 20 marker works. And then your conclusion is overall, why have you picked one interpretation over the other? And this is where it gets kind of fun, this one. It's a little bit like English, remember, where you can start considering the flaws of an interpretation. So you can say it only talks about one thing, or in fact, it might talk about several things. In interpretation 1, it talks about food, it talks about wages, it talks about a lot of things, it talks about hours of work. So you've got 3 things in interpretation 1 that it touches on. Maybe an interpretation might only focus on the strength through joy, so it doesn't talk about anything else. So you might find that as a bit of a negative. You can also bring in a lovely little bit of language, question on the language of an interpretation. One of them might be really dramatic, opinionated. One might be really factual, just straight to the point, and you might value that, or you might actually prefer an interpretation that's a bit more opinionated, using language that sort of makes it sound exciting. Well, you're a historian, you just literally want to know what's going on. So there's lots of ways you can identify whether you think an interpretation is good or not. What's it lacking? What does it include? What does it not include? And the tone and the language of the interpretations. Get a little bit of that in. Try and do that within the paragraphs if you can. But if you really must throw it in at the end and the conclusion, at least it's in there. And that really is how you get your full marks for this. So the 20 marker in this case is how far do you agree with interpretation 2 about the standard of living of workers in Nazi Germany. So again, pause the video, have a go at this. You could have a go at this in your booklets if you're doing this if you're in year 11. Otherwise, just write the thing and see if you can come up with a nice balanced essay where interpretation 2 is correct and interpretation 1 is also correct. But why do you agree with one more than the other? Not why do you agree that people's lives got better or not? Why do you agree with one of the interpretations? There's just something about one of them that just stuck out more to you. Got to say what that is. All right. So that said, we've now done part 1, reducing unemployment. Part 2, the living conditions, the economic miracle. I believe we've now done that, and quite well, in fact. So a 45-minute this lesson. We've had a lot of information out. You might want to break this down if you're revising in year 11 to, I don't know, 2 or 3 parts. But overall, hopefully you can see we've got a lot of information here that could support a section B all day long. And then, of course, a little summary from the textbook we use in class to make sure you've got these little knowledge facts secured. Thank you so much once again, as always, for watching this lesson. Hopefully it was helpful. This is a big topic, a nice topic to get your head around and prepare you for any type of question in the Germany paper. It's big. There's a lot of stuff in this lesson, so maybe watch it over a couple of days, or maybe watch one bit at a time. So the first part, the second part, and then the section B practice part if you want. But definitely make sure you do that practice in the section B. The sooner you get more confidence in that, the easier this Germany paper was going to be. And remember, it is worth the most, and it's definitely a bit more scripted than the other papers. So this is the one that we're going to hopefully bank on to get our grades up. Okay, so as always, over on stchistory.com, all lessons are there, recorded or as files. If you have any questions, ask your teacher, and we will see you on the next video. Thank you very much, and goodbye.